If you want to get an idea of the direction that the country is going, you don't have to look any further than places like California. Many states are just a few years, perhaps a decade behind where California is today. And so between New York, where I'm at, and California, the two spectrums on either end are the two most socialist states, meaning that if you were to look and to see where is the most welfare, where does the most welfare in America go? It goes to either New York or it goes to California. And so obviously what you end up with is less production. This is why when the government talks about how it takes more money to stimulate the economy, the reason being that it takes more money to stimulate the economy is because you have less people working. And so people look at, well, how much do I get via welfare versus how much do I get paid, right? And this is what happened during the pandemic, right? More people were paid to stay home than they were to go out and actually labor. And so people sit there and they're like, do I stay at home and just collect a welfare check? Or do I go out there and, work by the sweat of my brow, like the Bible says? And so what you end up with in socialism is you end up with more people on the public dole. This is why when they look at, for example, like job creation, one of the biggest creators of jobs is the government. And so all that is just socialism. The government is in essence creating jobs out of thin air. And of course, that's paid for via taxation, right? It's paid for via taxation and is paid for via people who produce either a good or a service within the country. And so when you look at places like California, when you wonder why home ownership is so expensive in California, why houses cost so much, people always talk about, like the boomers, like when you were a kid, it cost like 10 grand or 50 grand or whatever it was to buy a home. And then now they're trying to sell you as a Gen Xer or a Gen Z or a millennial. They're trying to sell you that house and that costs $500,000, right? Now, of course, in places like California, it's not surprising that California has the lowest home ownership in the whole country. And this is an article that came out in April of 2023. It talks about California has the lowest rate of home ownership in America, a study. This is done by KTLA, right? So this is a TV station that reported on this in California. And it says over 7 million of California's roughly 40 million residents own their home, the lowest rate of home ownership in the United States. It says a new study that was conducted by Ruby Home Luxury Real Estate analyzed the U.S. Census data to determine the rate of home ownership across the country. Residents in Maine had the highest rate of 32%. Think about that. Maine has the highest rate of home ownership, and only 1 out of 3 people own their home, meaning 66% of those people do not own their home. Well, who owns the home? Well, if it's not the people, more than likely it's some entity within the government, and we'll show that very quickly. So, and this is while California, on the other hand, of the spectrum at only 18.35%, right? So only 1 in 5 Californians own their own home. It says for California residents struggling to make ends meet, it says the news is probably not particular. The Golden State has some of the most expensive costs of living in the nation and a lack of inventory in real estate. And it goes on to state here, it says California has a lower home rate ownership than in places like Hawaii and New York, 2 other states famously with high cost of living, with Alaska and Nevada rounding out the top 5. And you can see the numbers here by state. Right, so no surprise that in terms of lowest home ownership, that of course California and New York are in the top 5. And then of course Nevada, which is close to California, obviously is impacted. Hawaii, the Hawaiians obviously been kicked out of the natives in essence moved out, and most of that people who own it are the cream of the crop, right? Like what just recently happened between with Oprah buying up land, etc., right? So this is what you end up with. And so in socialism, this is unfortunately what you get. The people get plunged into poverty. you will own nothing. And this is why they say in the future, right? This is why that statement is so true, especially for young people, for like millennials, Gen Zers, the Gen Alpha generation. You will come at a point where nobody owns their own home in many of these places. Like in many of these places, you'll see home ownership just disappear. And so what you'll end up with is a renter, as what they say is a renter economy. And so because the people can't afford it, what does the government do, right? To the people who actually own the homes, right? And so this video came out about 3 days ago. It's from California Insider Show, and it talks about landlords, right? The landlords are losing their homes, and they talk about here's why.
In Oakland, the eviction moratorium still exists. Can you tell us what's going on?
The people that provide housing to the community in Oakland, California are considered evil. During the eviction moratorium, to ask a tenant to pay rent could be viewed as harassment to the tenant.
Tenants can get advice from these groups, these lawyers, on how to avoid paying rent or sue the landlords.
Correct. There's been many housing providers that have not received any rent for 3 years.
My guest today is Chris Moore, board member with Bay Rental Housing Association. Today, he'll share with us his first-hand experience being a landlord in California and why he thinks the eviction moratorium is hurting the tenants.
What you have with politicians and tenant advocates is housing's a human right, housing should be free for all. It sounds really good, but if you truly read the ordinance, it's bad for tenants.
How is this going to impact the relationship of landlords and tenants going forward?
The city leaders, the tenant activists, they want this adversarial relationship because it benefits them.
Right, because the people who pay the lawyers is typically through the state. So the state funds the lawyers because the people are too poor to afford a lawyer. Now, of course, the only reason that they do this is because they're trying to seize the assets away from these landlords, right? And so this is why you saw Gavin Newsom was buying up homes when word got out that places, companies like BlackRock is just an extension of the government, just like Vanguard, right? Many of these entities that people can invest in, they're just extensions of the government because they actually have the authority to go out and to do what the government doesn't allow for, like the smaller business. Because at the end of the day, somebody has to own the home, somebody has to own the asset. And so what happens in socialism, this is why socialism leads to communism and why you end up just working for the government. Because as the people continue to ask for more free stuff, things become more expensive. The government has to print more money. So this is one of the reasons why home ownership becomes so expensive. But in the long run, right, this is the direction that we're going, where the country continues to fall deeper and deeper into socialism to the point where you have few people who are working. The people who are working are taxed very heavily, and then the government creates a lot of currency. And this is what we saw during the pandemic. So what happened during the pandemic is a glimpse of America's future. And of course, this is true, right? Whoever is going to give the people free stuff, well, that person is going to be voted into office. And he's just a figurehead for the people who actually run the government. And the people who actually run the government are communists. And they push socialism on the people by driving the people into poverty. And so this is why I had talked about. So as he had stated in the video, that what you end up with, right, if people can't, for example, find homes, well, then we got to build them, right? We got to build homes. That's the only way to do it. You either got to create more homes or people got to leave, right? Or people got to move, right? People got to die, right? When you have too few homes, the only solution is create more homes or have fewer people. Now, it's important to understand that real estate taxes funds the local government, right? The property tax is an ad valorem tax, meaning that it's based on the value of the property. So the government is incentivized to raise the value in dollar price, right, in the terms of the numerical value of the home, because the state is going to reap more money from the people who own the home, right? And so this is why rents continually go higher, and why rents continually to move up in many parts of the country, because the amount of homes that are being built versus the number of people who need homes is very few. And so this helps to keep property values high, which of course the government wants, and that because it keeps property taxes high. And of course, the landlords have to raise rents, and then the people can't afford it, and so then they go begging to the government that you need to do something. Well, the government can't build homes. They're not home builders. The only thing that they can do is either hand you a check, give you money, or do what California did and basically seize the means of production, right? They seized the homes from the landlords and said, you can't evict these people. You can't tell them they need to pay for their rent. That's considered harassment. They can live there for free because we own the guns. That's what communism is. And in essence, the people, because of socialism, end up advocating for communism. And so you get this little cycle of the people get pushed further into poverty, the government creates money, the people's labor becomes devalued, they can't afford assets like homes, and of course they're taxed annually, so in essence you never own your home. But that's not part of this discussion. This is the reality, unfortunately, for most Americans, and most Americans don't own their home. This is why for the people who actually do go out and buy a home, you buy it on a mortgage. Well, who gives you the mortgage, right? The government does, because that money is given to the banks through the government. And then you pay the land tax, right? And so in essence, it's owned by the government. And so that's what you get in communism, where the government owns the vast majority of these homes. And this is what you end up with, right? And so for much of the dollars that go overseas to places, for example, like in China, right? So there was an article here, because if the people only own 18% of the homes in California, well, then who owns the rest of the homes, right? So this was an article from 2018. And this was an article from 2018 from Cal Matters, talking about back in 2006 that China owned 10% of the single family homes in California. And this was a more recent article talking about in 2022 that real estate investors purchased 1 out of 5 homes in California. Well, then who is purchasing the other 4 out of 5? If real estate investors, and of course the government loves to paint this narrative that it's these greedy real estate investors. Well, they only bought 1 out of 5. So who was buying the other 4 out of 5? Well, that was the government. The government, through places like BlackRock, Vanguard. Gavin Newsom was literally outright buying homes for the California government, and then putting people under rent. And so that money, in essence, they were literally working for the government. This is what you get in communism. Look at, for example, what's going on in places like Chicago, right? You had the Chicago businesses like the supermarkets and the Dwayne Reeds, etc., that were being robbed. There was plenty of videos, I'm sure you've seen them, of people just taking whatever they wanted. And so what happened is the businesses are just like, we wash our hands, there's nothing we can do. You're allowing this to go on, and we can't just sit here and just keep letting ourselves get robbed. And so what did the governor of the governor of Chicago say? Well, we're going to open government-run supermarkets. And this is what you get under communism, where the people are driven into poverty. They advocate for more socialism, and then the only place that the government can get it from are from the people who produce, right? So from like these big businesses, from the corporations. This is why they talk about, we're gonna tax these greedy corporations. The way the government taxes those greedy corporations is really an extension of taxing you, because the only thing the corporations are going to do is just raise prices to offset the taxation. And so it's the government's way of saying, well, we're going to tax the people more, but we want the corporations to do it, and we want the corporations to take the fall. And at the end of the day, if things become even more expensive, well, then we're going to just outright steal money and steal directly from the producers. Now, people talk about how the government is fighting inflation. And this is what I talked about in relation to that the government is just going to reap more money. All these people who are asking for raises, and they're like, we're going to go on strike, we're going to demand more money. And this is from 2022, right? In 2022, the Federal revenues amounted to 4.9 trillion, 850 billion more than 2021, or 21%, right? So the government increased their revenue 21% more than their 2021 receipts. So what do you think is going to happen in 2023 with all these people asking for raises? That 4.9 trillion in terms of revenue is going to go higher. So you might see 5.4, 5.3 in terms of taxation from the people. And so while people are sitting here asking for more money, they're really not going to benefit in any way, shape, or form. And so back, if you remember, or we'll leave it here, back in 2022, the debt clock was 31 trillion, right? This is around the time that Joe Biden talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. And so what did the Inflation Reduction Act do? And so you can see it today, right? The U.S. national debt is now almost $33.7 trillion. And so the Inflation Reduction Act added almost 2.7 in terms of inflation upon the people. And so this narrative that the government, we're going to fight inflation, we're going to raise interest rates, it's not happening. It's a fugazi. It's fake news. It's just there. It's a talking point for people to sit there and be like, Joe Biden lowered the tax. He sits here and he talks about this shit, on social media. I'm so proud to have lowered the money by 1.5 trillion. And it's all nonsense. It's all a lie. And this is unfortunately the direction that the country will continue to go. And realistically speaking, the only way out of a situation like this is through revolution. It is the only way. No one in government is going to come to save you. The people have to be willing to save themselves. And it is what it is. No one is coming to save the American people. And this is why I say, when you look at the entire system, that we live under a communist at the top in terms of America who runs everything. And the people all over the earth live under socialism. And of course you have wealth within these different countries, but overwhelmingly most of that stuff is controlled at the top. Most of the wealth is controlled in the hands of very few people, and they basically run their part of the globe. But the people themselves, the people have their labor stolen from them because America just prints these dollars out of thin air. And so whatever you were laboring for at a rate in 2022, that rate no longer provides you an adequate standard of living anymore. If you think it's hard here, where America controls the dollars that they can just give you, imagine in countries where the people don't control the dollar. They don't have access to dollars. And all they have is their own foreign currency that their government prints. Just look at places like Argentina, right? Where the people get plunged into poverty. But this is why inevitably what you get is conflict. And they'll point to these people and look at this terrorism coming out of Gaza. Well, 80% of the people live in poverty. What do you expect? What do you expect them to do? Look at Black Americans. Most Black Americans live close to poverty. In another video, I'll talk about how 50% of New Yorkers are actually living below the poverty line. But I'll leave it here for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.